that you would take on the basis of trading that particular cycle. Okay, so that's the first thing that I thought I would say. This is what I believe is most likely to be occurring in the Australian markets at the moment. The markets, I believe, have a sense of humor. I know people might think that that's a bit odd, but I think the markets have a sense of humor. And what they will usually do is they will act in such a way as to postpone the moment at which you can actually say with absolute certainty that something has happened in the market. So what's happening at the moment is we're all watching and waiting anxiously to work out where that 40-week cycle trough is. The big question that I've been asking in ST Outlook, the blog that I publish every Saturday on our website, the big question I've been asking for the last several weeks, in fact since the Saturday the 9th of June, was it the 9th of June? I've been asking, has the 40-week cycle occurred? Now, as an analyst, of course, it's really important to know whether the 40-week cycle has occurred. As a trader, you need to be making trading decisions in advance. So the trading decisions you make in advance are on the basis of an analysis. So you need to you need to perform an analysis, and you need to put your money where your mouth is, and you need to say, I believe that this is the analysis that is playing out. The great thing about analyzing markets and trading markets using Hurst cyclic principles is that even if you are wrong, usually you are only wrong by a matter of degree. And so so you can nevertheless make a profitable trade even though the 40-week cycle hasn't occurred. And there's an example of this in the Australian market at the moment, and we'll have a look at it. But this is the analysis that I believe is playing out, which means, as you can see, that that there was a I need to select a pen. There we go. That there was a 20-week trough in March, and the trough on the 4th of June was of only 80-day magnitude, which means that, of course, we need another 80-day cycle to elapse before the 40-week cycle actually occurs. So we're looking at about another 10 weeks. Okay, just over 3 weeks have passed, so we're looking at another 7 weeks before the 40-week cycle occurs. And of course, I do expect that cycle trough will occur even lower. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that I believe that markets have a sense of humor. Why do I say that? Well, let's zoom in and take a look at what's happened. Let me just get rid of some of these counts. There we go. Let's have a look at what's happened since the trough on the 2nd of June. And as you can see, we've had what I believe is the first 20-day trough, and it is a very well-shaped, a beautiful M shape. As you know, I'm obsessed by cycle shapes. There is a very beautiful M shape. It looks like a perfect M. That's the shape that has occurred. Now, why do I say the market's got a sense of humor? Well, because if the market had dropped down below this trough over here, then we would have said, okay, so the 40-week cycle has almost certainly not occurred, because if within the first 20-day cycle following a 40-week cycle, if price drops down below that 40-week cycle, that pretty much rules out the formation of that 40-week cycle. There's an interesting comparison to be drawn with Elliott wave theory here. Elliott wave theory has an absolute rule. If you have a price moves up in a wave 1, then when it comes down in a wave 2, it cannot come lower than a wave 1. Otherwise, that completely eliminates that possible Elliott wave count. The comparison with Hurst cyclic theory is interesting because there is not an absolute rule. Even if this 20-day cycle had dipped slightly below that potential 40-week cycle that occurred over here, that does not eliminate that count. However, for the first 20-week cycle following a 40-week cycle, to fall below the trough of that 40-week cycle is a very clear and strong indication that the phasing of that 40-week cycle is premature. And that's more a rule of thumb than an absolute rule like it is in Elliott wave theory. If the 20-week thanks Jose, I see you're off. See you next time. If the 20-week cycle trough were to drop below an 80, I beg your pardon, if a 20-day cycle trough was to fall below an 80-day cycle trough, that is a cycle trough of only 2 degrees longer, as you can see there, than the 20-day cycle, then that is quite possible, and is something that that will happen fairly often, that the 20-day cycle will fall below the prior trough of 80-degree magnitude. Okay, so it's a little bit of a digression. But now let's quickly take a look at the shape of this 20-day cycle. Let me draw it again. There it is again. What is the shape of that cycle? It is still, if the cycle is complete, and I believe it probably is, I believe that 2 days ago that 20-day cycle probably, that 20-day cycle trough probably formed in the Australian markets. So that is a slightly bullish cycle. Slightly bullish cycle shape, which fits with this analysis perfectly. If you're looking at only the 2 cycles longer than the 20-day cycle, according to this analysis, the 2 longer are both up. Okay, so considering only the 2 cycles longer, we would expect a bullish cycle to develop here. If you look at a whole lot more cycles, then of course the next 2 cycles longer than the 80-day cycle are both pointing down. Okay. So you would have -1 from the 40-week, -1 from the 20-week, and then +1 from the 80-day, and +1 from the 40-day. So you get a pretty much a neutral trend, a neutral underlying trend for the 20-day cycle, which means we're expecting a pretty much neutrally shaped cycle. And this shape is slightly bullish, but actually very neutral. How do you define a neutral underlying trend? Well, it depends where the 2 peaks occur. Of course, every cycle has 2 peaks. There's the first peak, and there's the second peak. And the other thing that defines the cycle shape is, of course, where the final trough of that cycle occurs relative to the first trough. And as we saw, the final trough of this particular cycle has occurred only very, very slightly above the initial trough. So this looks to me very much like a very neutrally shaped 20-day cycle. So that fits perfectly with this particular analysis, which means that I think this particular analysis is exactly what is happening in the Australian market. If you are busy trading this market, and let's say you were trading the 40-day cycle, then of course as price fell into this trough here in early June, you might have considered taking a trade, because your analysis at that time would have been telling you that there's a possibility that the 40-week cycle is about to form. So you might have, in fact, taken a trade at that time. What would have happened if you did? Let's turn on some FLDs and see what would have happened. The simplest and easiest trade that you would have taken entering a 40-day cycle trade would have been to enter somewhere around where price crossed the 20-day FLD. The 20-day FLD I've plotted is this line over here, okay, which would have meant that if you were trading the 40-day cycle and you thought there was a possibility that the 40-week cycle was about to occur on the 4th of June, then you would have entered the market over here on the 5th, no, I beg your pardon, on the 6th, 7th, somewhere around the 6th or 7th of June, okay, where price crossed that 20-day FLD. So you possibly would have bought into the market somewhere round about here, and you would have been expecting that market to go up. How would you have fared? Well, you would have monitored very closely the shape of all the smaller cycles. And so the first 10-day cycle, as you can see very simply, looked slightly bullish, but not very bullish, because it had a fairly early peak. Okay, slightly worrying sign, that early peak. So you probably would have started setting fairly tight stops. Then you would have witnessed the market move up again to a second peak. And let me just clear this so that I can make my point as clear as possible. So when you were sitting here at the end of trading, that would have been last week, Wednesday, and you're looking at the cycle shape that was unfolding, you would have known that you had a slightly bullish cycle, okay, because you had a higher peak over here. It is higher than this peak over here. And the 20-day cycle had its peak fairly far into the cycle. Okay, that far into the cycle, and you would have expected the 20-day cycle to fall to a trough somewhere over here. But round about this time, you would have started realizing that the cycle shape that was unfolding was not looking very bullish. So you would have started taking a look at alternate analyses, and you would have said, is there a possible analysis that might be playing out in this market that has the current 20-day cycle that I'm looking at as rather neutral underlying trend, slightly bullish rather than very bullish? Okay, if that really was a trough of the 40-week cycle, you would have expected a much more bullish cycle shape. So when you're trading using Hurst cyclic principles, you're constantly monitoring the cycles as they unfold in the market, and you're looking at the shapes that are being created. Okay, and at that point you would have said this is a slightly bullish shape, but not a very bullish shape, and therefore, as a sensible trader, you most probably would have tightened your stops, because you know that at this point the market is going to go down to form a trough of the 20-day cycle. It's all very well speaking with hindsight, but so I'm not going to say at what level you might have exited. All I would say is that if you were monitoring your trade at that point, you would have said this is not looking very bullish. It's looking more neutral. I'm in a trade based on the 40-week cycle. I think I should tighten my stops, possibly even take some profits and get out of this trade. Okay, and so you could possibly have made either a break-even trade or a slightly profitable trade on the basis of trading the 40-day cycle, even though your initial premise for the whole trade, which was the 40-week cycle, had formed in price. Actually, with retrospect, turns out to have been wrong, because it hasn't formed yet. And I mean, I need to add lots of allegedlys and lots of possibly hasn't formed, because it is possible that 40-week cycle trough has formed, and we might be looking back in a month's time or